Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I explore the future of food, and in particular, the future of alternative meat production with the Good Food Institute's co-founder and executive director, Bruce Friedrich. Bruce is a really unique voice in the world of innovation, food production, and animal advocacy. Bruce is a really interesting example of someone that, brings the richness of the free market to life, because he's trying to bring market forces to bear on problems that in many cases are created by market forces. The rise of animal agriculture in its concentrated form and the externalities and problems that brings about, both for the environment and for animal rights and animal welfare. And yet he's doing it 100% focused on delivering value for the consumer. And so that's what makes Good Food Institute and Bruce Friedrich's work so exciting. And so with all that said, I hope you enjoy this conversation. Okay, so Bruce Friedrich, I was hearing about you long before we got a chance to meet, because when I first met my wife and business partner in everything, Lisa, the first thing she explained to me was that her father was a Burger King franchisee, and that she was responsible for leading the charge over many years to get a veggie burger on the Burger King menu. And the longer telling of the story is that she would call people for the ethical treatment of animals, PETA, and she had this contact she would talk to repeatedly, explaining the updates and, they're testing the patty, and I got John Robbins to engage with them, and this was happening and that was happening. And then eventually it happened, and there was a press release, and it was like, press release from Miami, here, the BK Veggie coming now nationwide. And that she said, my friend from PETA said, Lisa, we thought you were crazy the whole time. And my understanding is that friend was you.
I don't think I said I thought she was crazy. No, I was pretty excited to have insider information from Lisa throughout those many years. I think we thought she was unduly optimistic. And I will say, it was pretty fascinating. So she convinced her father, who convinced Burger King to launch the BK Veggie. And there really is, like fast food restaurants, things have to sell. And they have to sell enough to earn their key, right? On a very, a relatively small cashier pad. They no longer punch in numbers, which would make it easy for them to have basically, just have some veggie patties in a freezer and, serve them up. It now has to sell, enough that it warrants one of a limited number of keys. And so there are areas of the world where the BK Veggie, didn't sell particularly well for a while. And I think it was Lisa and her father who kept it on the national menu, which is sort of a pretty fascinating example of the power of one. And now it's the Impossible Whopper, and it satisfies meat eaters, but there were previous iterations that, as a vegetarian, I was more than happy to eat it, but I think it's not really going to convert a lot of people.
Yeah, early in our relationship, this was something that there was a handful of things. She was passionate about animals. She was, and that was why she was a mostly vegan, but, would sometimes eat dairy. And the other early memory that I think you'll appreciate that was kind of related was we went to a dinner with, I guess it was the founder of Garden Burger, and there was this pause moment where it must have been the quarter to the hour or whatever that is in the cadence of a conversation, where you have like a little pause. And I was sitting there thinking, I let my thoughts happen aloud. And I said, it's kind of interesting because in the absence of there being such a thing as a hamburger, you wouldn't really have veggie burgers, right? Like, why would you take these vegetables and process them in this particular way into this particular shape and season them to try to achieve this flavor if there wasn't the hamburger to precede it? And I wasn't meaning to be like, you owe your whole business to the hamburger, although that's a kind of a statement of the obvious. But I was so, it was like a child navigating this landscape that I didn't realize how deep and vast it was of the, vegetarianism and the nascent industries that were trying to bring it about. I mean, it almost today now, vegan's almost more popular as a buzzword than vegetarian, I feel like. But even just 20 years ago, it was something that you could get away with not knowing anything about well into adulthood, as I was a testament to.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I don't know, though, on the whole hamburger thing. I don't know who had the idea to take beef and turn it into what now is a hamburger. But I will say that Indians have been putting wheat and potatoes and corn into, patty-ish and frying it up. And, it's a pretty common way to eat food. So eating vegetables in a similar way doesn't seem so out of bounds. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that the idea of the garden burger was so vegetarians would have something to eat at a barbecue, or when they went to the Friends of Meat Eaters or whatever else, for sure.
So, we're going to get to the Good Food Institute, which you head up and founded, and is a very exciting organization that there's so much to talk about there. But to get to that place, I want to start at the beginning with, how did you end up at PETA? How did you get involved in this food and animals passion, the ethics of it, and just getting involved in it? Because there's one thing to have a passion, it's another thing to enter into sort of the, everybody likes to say movement. I often like to say industry, but the industry or movement, whichever you prefer. Like, where does it start for you?
It started in college. I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet, which is now almost 50 years old. I read it in 1987. And the author of Diet for a Small Planet, a woman named Frances Moore Lappe, basically points out that growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals is extraordinarily inefficient. So probably everybody listening is concerned about food waste. Pretty much everybody now is concerned about food waste, as so many people are living in nutritional deficit, so many people suffering from malnutrition. The idea that we would throw away 40% of the food that we produce, I think people see as moral anathema, and I think justifiably so. But the physiology of farm animals means that the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat is the chicken, and it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. That means that you are basically throwing away 8 calories of corn, wheat, oats, alfalfa, 8 calories of what's fed to the chicken. You're essentially throwing away because the chicken burns off those calories existing, or a few of those calories go into feathers, bones, blood, things that we don't eat. So it's essentially 800% food waste. So we're all concerned about 40% food waste. This is 20 times that by eating chickens, and it's even worse for farmed fish, for cattle, for pigs. And that was essentially Lappe's argument. And then she looks at the global food system, and she looks at the economics of growing crops and developing economies to ship those crops to developed economies to feed to farm animals. She doesn't, I don't think, look at what's happening in Brazil, where 100% of the soy grown in the rainforest as they burn down the rainforest and grow soy to feed to farm animals. 100% of that soy is fed to farm animals. None of it goes for human consumption, and it throws indigenous farmers off their land. Those are the sorts of relationships she was looking at. And then I ended up majoring in economics, focusing on agricultural economics, and writing my honors thesis on structural adjustment programs. So the programs that the World Bank and the IMF put together for developing economies in order to guarantee loans, essentially, and cash crops. And the more I dived into it, the more I thought it didn't make a lot of sense. So my original reason for caring about agriculture, sort of brought forward to today is, how do we feed so many people? So today we're going to have 9.7 billion people by 2050. How do we do that? The inefficiencies of growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals doesn't make a lot of sense. And then the environmental issues. And she wrote the book 50 years ago, so she wasn't talking about climate change, but she was talking about water pollution and soil desertification and air pollution and these sorts of things from the inefficiencies I just described. And that all had a really big impact on me. When I got out of college, I went and ran a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen, the largest soup kitchen in Washington, D.C., and then a shelter for families. And while I was there, I read a book by a Christian theologian, an Anglican priest named Andrew Linzey, called Christianity and the Rights of Animals. And I'd actually been a vegetarian for 3 or 4 years at that point, but that was the book that really got me thinking about animals. And as you mentioned, I was at PETA for a while. It was kind of full circle for me, though, coming back to GFI, because GFI's primary focus is the two big questions in food. How do we feed 9.7 billion people by 2050? What do we do about climate change? How do we keep antibiotics working? Sort of those global health, environmental, food security reasons that were why I got interested in food in the first place.
Yeah, I was so struck by how economics oriented you were from when we first got to meet, which I can't remember where exactly it was. It might have been at John Mackey's house.
Yeah, I think it was a dinner party at John's house during South by Southwest.
And I think, and it was exciting to hear, because I think, if you're coming into this issue with no background, and you're someone who eats a standard American diet, although even that term is a little pejorative, as if there's a single standard American diet. But if you eat a fair amount of meat, and meat's pretty tasty, you come to these things for the first time. I'll just speak for myself, like being Italian, meat's a big part of the cuisine. It's a real bummer, right? It's like, you don't want to, we made, Lisa and I made our documentary At the Fork. And our tension about diet was like the sort of inciting incident that we set up. And it was totally true. We really, this was like the one area that was a real source of tension in our relationship, because this was something she was so passionate about. And my family, like actually the rest of her family, was super passionate about all the foods we liked. And making those leaps to the morals and the ethics and the economics and the environmental impacts, all the other things that extend out from the choices you make, is really difficult. So how are you, so PETA was an outreach, or is an advocacy organization. So what were the lessons, like how were you thinking about communicating to people about this stuff when you were at PETA, and what did you kind of observe there as far as just how to think about communicating this, because it's so difficult?
Yeah, I think obviously nobody wants to be lectured at. Nobody wants to be told they're wrong or told they're bad. At GFI, we don't spend any time on the issue of individual dietary change. So our focus is really on systems. Our biggest focus is on convincing governments that they should be funding open source science into biomimicking meat with plants or growing meat directly from cells without all the inefficiencies of raising live animals. And then our second biggest focus is on convincing corporations, so the Nestle's, the ADMs, the Tyson's, Cargills, Purdue's, that this is something they should get in on. It's a new way of producing the exact same product. In the case of growing meat from cells, it's a new way of providing consumers everything that they want, but more cost effectively, more efficiently, more sustainably in the case of plant-based meat. So those are really the key focuses. And then we also work with restaurants and grocery stores and investors and entrepreneurs. Yeah, I mean, and then scientists, convincing scientists that, so if somebody's a tissue engineer or a plant biologist or a meat scientist for that matter, convincing them that this is vocationally something that they can do that will allow them to do very well professionally for their families, and then also do a lot of good in the world. So consumer dietary choice is not something that we spend time on. We're focused at sort of the supply side at kind of a much higher level. So backtracking to your question about PETA, I mean, there was sort of this dichotomy, right? If you wanted to get the media to pay attention, you had to do something like controversial.
Right. Like Pam Anderson naked in a faux fur or something. They were master marketers at PETA.
Yes.
They still are.
They still are. It's true. But if you want to actually convince an individual, it helps a lot to go in with a questioning attitude. And, I mean, everybody cares about animals. Nobody wants to make choices that are unsustainable or bad for global health or whatever. But you really did hit on it earlier. I mean, meat is tasty. And I think when you're thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you've got the physiological needs that form the base, very few people are willing, and I don't know if it's even conscious, it might be completely subconscious, but most people are not going to, where physiological needs are concerned, they're not going to take the higher ethical values as much into account. And we find this over and over and over. Literally every survey that's been done about what dictates what consumers buy and eat, the top three factors are, is it delicious, is it reasonably priced, and is it convenient? And when you scale, when you do those weighted scales, where if it's number one, it's weighted higher. If it's number two, it's weighted higher. Literally, those are the only things that break zero are taste and price. Convenience is right at zero. And literally everything else is down below. So the goal of GFI is to give consumers what they want. The holy grail, let's make products that taste the same or better and that cost the same or less. That's the goal. And hey, they're also safer for your family, and they have these other ancillary benefits in terms of food sustainability, environmentalism, animal protection, and so on.
So people that listen to the show, people that know anything about me or my work know that I'm Mr. Capitalism. I big believer, like John Mackey is, in power of markets as an engine of incentives and information, as a way to have the information of reality out there, all of people's different wants and desires, get transmitted continually in real time through prices. And then for those prices and the opportunities that are out there to be an incentive, to be something that spurs people to do things that they might not otherwise do, or know to do, or want to do, or want to do at the margin. Like, okay, maybe I want to try here, but you know what? If I'm not going to make any more money, am I really going to try? Okay, that Impossible Burger is pretty good, but it's not $20 good. But if it's $8, okay, If it's $5, oh sure, it's close enough. Great. If it's cheaper than meat, oh, I'm in. Was that? I mean, I didn't realize you studied economics. So was that sort of appreciation for the market process, for sort of cost benefit? Was that with you all along, or the way you're focusing now with the Good Food Institute on market-based solutions and on policy that is oriented towards essentially delivering people, as you said, like delivering to people what they want, but doing it in a way that's better for everyone, that's sort of holistically better for all of the stakeholders, if you will. Did you arrive at that was there an aha moment for you where you said, this is where we're going to make real change happen? Or was that something that you always had a sense of, and this is the culmination or the realization of a long felt path for you?
I mean, it's a little of both, John, quite honestly. So certainly my degree is in economics, and I am a bit of an economics policy wonk. I care a lot about economics and enjoy reading economics. The sort of aha moment, and I don't know that it was a precise moment exactly, but got to know Ethan Brown soon after he started Beyond Meat. Have known Josh Tetrick for probably 20 years, the guy who started the company now called Just, formerly Hampton Creek. Have known the person, Tal Ronan, who runs Crossroads, and worked with Pat Brown on both Impossible Foods and Kite Hill. So the people who started the companies in this space, I've been close with, some of them since many years before they started the companies. And the idea of competing with meat, the sort of thing that Ethan Brown says all the time. He says, look, meat is made up of minerals, aminos, lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. That's all meat is. All of those things also exist in plants. We can biomimic meat with plants. We can replicate everything that people like about meat, the taste, the texture, and so on, and we can do that with plants. And then when I was at PETA, coming across a guy named Vladimir Mironov and another fellow named Nick Genovese, who were talking about growing meat from cells. And just thinking, wow, that is like, we don't have to go through the inefficiency of growing massive amounts of crops and funneling them through animals. So those sorts of ways of playing into market economics, and the fact that making meat from plants instead of growing those plants and feeding them to animals, or growing actual animal meat in cultivators instead of raising animals and shipping, raising crops and shipping it to a feed mill and operating a feed mill and shipping the feed to the farm and operating the farm and shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse and operating the slaughterhouse. Let's just grow the cells, or let's just grow those crops, ship them to a factory, and basically figure out how we biomimic using mechanical engineering. Let's figure out and meat science, let's figure out how we biomimic meat with plants. Like all of that really came about because of principally, Pat and Tal and Ethan and Josh, and the fact that they were actually doing that stuff. But it wasn't a tough sell for me. Like once I started thinking, wow, like the efficiencies of this are going to dominate the market, assuming we can get the taste right. Like that was pretty intuitive. But it was, it's one of those things where you're like, oh my God, of course. How did I not think about this 20 years ago? But yeah, I think it makes just a tremendous amount of sense.
So tell me about how you had, like, how the organization came into existence. This is what I would call a social enterprise. You're a nonprofit, but you're a really interesting hybrid. So I really like for people who really want to get your sort of classic conscious capitalism institution building is the way I see it. These problems that kind of like simpleton economics will say, well, that's not what markets do. Markets don't solve these kind of problems because of externalities and blah, blah, blah. And there's like a blackboard and you put therefore government or therefore magic thing that's not people in a marketplace. But you're engaging right at that focal point where you've got these interesting things where you're making some bets on ideas that aren't yet fully competitive in terms of price or flavor, but there's a vision there. So how did this get started? How, like, what was the seed of GFI and how, and you know, and how was it imagined from the get-go?
Yeah, I mean, the seed of GFI was conversations that I was having circa 2015 with Tal Ronan, the guy who founded Crossroads and co-founded Kite Hill, and Josh Balk and Josh Tetrick, the co-founders of Just, and Ethan Brown, the founder of Beyond Meat, and then reading about what was happening with Pat Brown and Impossible Foods, and saying, this is just so absolutely right. How has this not occurred to me? And then thinking with other people who sort of the brain trust that became the Good Food Institute, thinking about what it would look like, whether there is room for a nonprofit organization, and realizing that there was, I mean, what was happening with the companies was and is spectacular. But what was happening is sort of a slow road to the promise of this mission. So plant-based meat, you have people like Pat Brown and Ethan Brown, and they have the idea for their companies. Then they have a company. Then they start hiring scientists, and
Right.
all of the R&D happens in a silo, and it's all protected by IP. The same thing happens with cultivated meat. You've got people like Mark Post and Uma Valetti, and Luke Cooperhouse and his team at Blue Nalu. And they hire meat scientists and tissue engineers and chemical engineers and mechanical engineers. And they get to work doing all of this R&D, and it's all protected, right? And the concept there is, let's disrupt this industry. So as we were thinking about this, you know, and what a nonprofit could do, it occurred to us that nobody had ever mapped out what is the technological readiness of plant-based meat? What is the technological readiness of cultivated meat? What are the critical technology elements that go into these ways of producing meat? What are the white space areas? Where are the areas where we know what the questions are and we can solve them, and we can solve them for everybody so that we can create an entire ecosystem? There was also nobody educating investors. There was nobody cultivating entrepreneurs. There was certainly nobody reaching out to the big food companies to say, you know, you can be disrupted or you can be part of the disruption. You can turn this from disruption to transformation if you get involved now. And I mean, this is something that you talk about, John, but the people at Tyson and JBS and Cargill, like these folks, their goal is to provide high quality protein to as many people as possible, as profitably as possible. Like none of them are invested in raising animals. None of them are invested in slaughtering animals. If they can create the exact same product more cost effectively and satisfy their consumers, and hey, by the way, also not have the sort of external costs that cause them headaches, of course they're going to go for that. Like one of my favorite moments was a cover story about the former CEO of Tyson. And it ended with, if we can make chicken without the animal, why wouldn't we? And exactly, yes, right. Of course. But nobody was reaching out to the corporations and saying, hey, we've got a team of scientists who would be happy to come in and talk with your R&D teams about this, which GFI does. And then on the policy side, governments fund innovation. So governments help sort of lift entire spheres, and the US government puts a couple $2 billion a year into ag R&D every year. Governments put tens of billions of dollars into environmental initiatives, many focused on climate change. Even pre-COVID, governments were putting more than $100 billion into global health initiatives. So the goal of our policy team, and then we also have teams in India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific out of Hong Kong, and Europe out of Brussels and London. The goal is to go to governments and say, for the same reason you're funding agricultural initiatives, environmental initiatives, global health initiatives, this better way of making meat pays significant dividends across all of those vectors. You should be funding that stuff too. And obviously there's not a private company reason to do that lobbying. So is there room for a nonprofit organization was our question 5 years ago. And yeah, overwhelming room for a nonprofit. There are a lot of things that industry is likely to solve this problem eventually. But if we can get corporations involved and educate them, if we can get investors and entrepreneurs starting more companies and investing in those companies, if we can get the big corporations involved and the governments involved and more scientists, like we're launching a university program, we're publishing peer review articles. We need to make sure that tissue engineers and plant biologists, I said this a minute ago, we need to make sure that everybody who would otherwise be going into therapeutics or chemicals or whatever, that they know about this area as well. And then pair them with the startups or pair them with the big companies who are looking for a CTO who's a tissue engineer. All these sorts of things are ample opportunity for a nonprofit. So that was the vision of GFI, and that is, in fact, those are the things we're working on now.
So I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit because since we do a lot of work with nonprofits, I'm somewhat familiar with some of the different structures. So there's 501c3. These are like tax designations. They're almost meaningless other than the IRS tax code. But those are organizations that tend to be purely educational. If you're dealing in advocacy, you can or dealing with public policy to the level of legislation, or sometimes you can't do certain things as a C3, so you maybe have a C4. And then there's these organizations, C6s, like chambers of commerce. It seems like what you're describing, the scope of GFI kind of straddles these different domains in a lot of interesting ways. So did you set up essentially one entity, or is it a little bit of a constellation of different sort of entities under the umbrella? I mean, like, how did you build this institution that you've created? Like, what were the mechanics of it?
Yeah, so we set up as a C3, and you're right. As a C3, we can't have anything to do with endorsing or opposing specific candidates, and we have significant limits on the amount of lobbying we can do focused on legislation. We do have a policy team. We do quite a lot of work on legislation. We also do a fair bit of litigation and a lot of regulatory work. Right now, we are exclusively a C3, which means donations to GFI are completely tax deductible. As a C4, donations would not be tax deductible. We actually have set up a C4, but it's not operational yet. We set it up in case we get up to our lobby limit as the C3, and the IRS has fairly strict rules about how much you can spend on lobbying, and we haven't hit that number yet, so we haven't had to sort of pull the trigger on and start the C4, but it exists in case we get up to that limit. And then we do GFI funds affiliate organizations. So GFI Brazil, GFI India, GFI Asia Pacific, GFI Europe, and GFI India. Each of those are separate organizations with their own boards of directors and their own managing directors and their own staffs. That are largely funded by GFI US. They bring in a little of their own money as well, but mostly those teams are funded by the US. And right now we have just north of 60 people in the United States and 38 people across those other 5 affiliate offices.
So for someone that's listening to our conversation and saying, like the hairs on the back of their head are standing up when they hear the word lobbying. Explain what that means. What does it mean to lobby? I think it's a term that gets a really bad rap, but I think it's misunderstood.
So there are two principal things that GFI is focused on at the federal level. So lobbying just means that, I guess you could do lobbying for the executive branch as well, where you go in and you meet with the FDA or the USDA or EPA or whatever, and you lobby executive officials. But generally, I think the lobby limits, so like you can do unlimited executive agency lobbying without hitting your cap as a C3. You can spend your entire life at USDA if you want to. Where the limits come in on lobbying, and probably where if people see lobbying as a pejorative, it probably has to do with attempting to influence legislation, which is how lobbying is defined when you talk about lobby caps. So we have to track all of our time that we spend, for example, on Capitol Hill, working to convince legislators that in the House and Senate agricultural appropriations bills, that some of the agricultural research service budget, which is about $1.1 billion, and one of our key lobby activities is not to get more money from taxpayers, but it is to convince the House and the Senate that they should allocate some of that money toward alternative protein R&D, plant-based and cultivated meat R&D, oftentimes with a focus on the land grant universities. And then we also do some work on the science and technology side, actually working with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which is an executive branch agency. Another example of lobbying, so multiple states have now passed laws that make it illegal to call a veggie burger a veggie burger. So right. For example, the state of Missouri passed a law that gives you up to a year in jail if you label your veggie burger, or plant-based ham, or sort of anything using any kind of meat terminology on the label, even if it very, very clearly says, vegan, even bigger than burger. You can go to jail for that. And before that law passed, we're suing the state of Missouri. We're also suing Arkansas and got an injunction. But before those laws passed, we lobbied the state legislature in Arkansas and Missouri and said, hey, this is an unconstitutional law. It violates the First Amendment. It also violates the Supremacy Clause. It's preempted by the Federal Meat Inspection Act and that sort of thing. And we had to track all of the hours that we spent trying to convince legislators that they should not pass that law. That's some of the lobbying that GFI has done. And we've done a lot of lobbying. There, I think, been like 15 states that have proposed these laws. We have convinced legislatures not to pass them in most states. It's definitely something that across the spectrum, libertarians hate it because it's total nanny state, putting its thumb on the scales and preferencing some producers over others. And then the other side of the aisle doesn't like it because it's, protecting incumbent sort of big industry against the small startups, which actually I guess the libertarians and conservatives also are not very keen on that.
I think what has been your observation of the behavior of these? I'm sure I'm sure every agency and every person inside the different government agencies, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these people and these organizations, operate differently. They operate within different spheres of influence and like biases. But have you found consistent biases within the federal government in particular when it comes to these policies? I mean, I have some familiarity with some of these things, and it seems like there is a lot of baked in sort of status quo. We have the presidential election starting in Iowa. Like, why? Because we have mandates to put corn in gas tanks for no one thinks that's a good idea. Nobody thinks corn-based ethanol is efficient or good that I can find. But we still have a mandate.
The farmers of Iowa are down with it.
Yeah, the farmers of Iowa like corn-based ethanol. It's basically an alternative just direct payments, and it's an indirect subsidy by virtue of forcing me to put it in my car. Are you hitting that kind of roadblock? Does it depend on the state? Like, what have you learned about trying to move this Goliath of government towards a different mentality, one that's so much more, progressive in the true sense of like advancing new technological fronts that are highly disruptive? I mean, you say, who doesn't want to eliminate the chicken from, Tyson corporate might be saying that, but I know a couple chicken growers that would hear that and say, well, you're just putting me out of business. So, what's been your experience of this process so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly at the federal level, there's a lot of sympathy. So GFI does not go in opposing current subsidies. We don't go in, we're not trying to take anything away from anyone. We're not sort of like taking on the meat industry or meat industry interests in Washington. We're going in and we're saying, hey, help small business, help innovation, help science. And by the way, look what China's doing, look what Singapore's doing, look what Europe's doing, look what Israel's doing. The US is right now the lead on alternative proteins. We have Beyond Meat, we have Impossible Foods, we have a small crop of cultivated meat companies, but that may not be true for long. Look at the funding that Israel is doing and the Netanyahu government. Look at the funding that Europe is doing. We need to be the lead on this. And that messaging, small business, science, innovation, US interests, agriculture, that tends to play pretty well across the spectrum in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. That is less true with state legislatures. So there has been label censorship proposed in Washington, D.C. It has a vanishingly small chance of going anywhere because legislators in Washington, D.C. Recognize that it's silly and unconstitutional. That is less of a concern in a fair number of state legislatures, where oftentimes, the legislature is only in for one out of 2 years, and they're only in for like 4 months of that time. And I'm in New Hampshire. I don't think they have offices in New Hampshire. If you get the list of legislators in New Hampshire, you actually get all of their cell phones and home phone numbers. Like it's a pretty not laid back gig exactly, but I mean it is very retail politics. And one person who is a cattle rancher or one person who is a dairy farmer and who knows everybody else in the legislature, they're all friends, and they're, it's sort of the vested interest of that person and her or his family in a way that's very different from Washington, D.C. And in a lot of these states, it's not one person who's a dairy farmer or a cattle rancher. It's a whole bunch of dairy farmers and pig farmers and cattle ranchers who make up
Wisconsin,
the legislature. And they're like, yeah, exactly. And they're like, I will pass the unconstitutional law and the government will sign the unconstitutional law. And then you're going to have to come and sue us. And they don't personally suffer from that. It's money out of the state coffers. But it is kind of ironic that some of the, like farmers are sort of the rugged individualism. And so farmers passing these protectionist measures is a little bit strange, but that is in fact kind of how it works and what happens.
Well, it's funny. I got to be pretty friendly with Mike McCloskey, who's a big dairy farmer in Indiana, and he's featured in our film. And I know they've had some animal welfare issues that have come out more recently, Fair Oaks Farms, but he sort of said the opposite in terms of farmers. He said, farmers tend to be a sort of, in his words, sort of a bit of a communistic kind of lot. That's a quote from him. I'm not being a neo-McCarthyite there. I'm not wearing my grumpy old capitalist hat right now. And if you look back in American history, you kind of see it. You see, I have a theory about this, which is agriculture is so exposed to the randomness of the elements, right? You have so much, bumper crops and crop failures and weather that just wipes things out, and you plant in the spring and you harvest in the fall, and you're making these bets, and then it can all go boom or bust. And so they've been, as an industry, historically just battered by something that's truly beyond anybody's control, which is the weather. And so there's always been these movements, sort of populist movements, to protect farmers. Like William Jennings Bryant, and this desire for free silver in the 1800s, because those terrible bankers in New York were not letting us repay our loans, and they were holding us to like the golden cross of the gold standard. There's all these sort of things that are all tied up with the booms and busts of agriculture. So it kind of makes, and then the Great Depression, obviously, a lot of these programs that are still in place come about. So you have like this deep set of institutions and habits and cultural baggage about protecting agriculture, and you're really bringing in a highly disruptive vision for that. So that's got to be scary for a lot of folks. I mean, I know if you're like a Georgetown policy wonk, and it's like, I like innovation, this sounds great, but if you're like a Nebraska cattle rancher or a Wisconsin dairy farmer, or a chicken grower in North Carolina, I mean, this Bruce Frederick's got one out for you. So, like, have you found that being focused on the supply side, like, is that like, well, that's how we roll, or is there anything you have to do to mitigate that, or to bring the farmers into the conversation, or is that sort of, this is the way the innovation cookie crumbles? How do you think about that?
I mean, I am excited to give talks to farmer groups, and I have given presentations to farmer groups and at a dairy conference, and our corporate engagement director went and spoke at the big annual cattle convention. And I think farmers know as well as anyone that the massive consolidation of agriculture of the last 25, 30 years owes literally nothing to plant-based meat or vegetarianism or veganism, for that matter.
Yeah, certainly true.
You look at the sort of get big or get out, not a mantra exactly, it's just a reality of farming these days. And that agricultural consolidation is what has sort of really hurt farmers. The vision that GFI is focused on is one that would allow for us to move away from monocropping for feed crops, for example. So as we move from animal-based meat to plant-based meat, one of the projects that we're working on in India has to do with millet characterization and using millets in alternatives to animal meat. And I mean, so far it's been sort of soy, wheat, and peas, but there's no reason it has to have been soy, wheat, and peas. Impossible experimented with potatoes, and in fact, potato protein was the protein of the version 1 of the Impossible burger. But it could be lentils, it could be sorghum. There are a wide variety of crops that it could be. And obviously farmers are going to have to plant those crops, and they will be able to get better prices for those crops if it's not feed for chickens, if it's actually an ingredient in plant-based meat or an ingredient in the cell feed for cultivated meat. So we think this brings us back to a better time for farmers, where agricultural consolidation at the farm level was not basically bankrupting anybody who wasn't colossal. And then B, it's also significantly better for manufacturing. So right now, working in slaughterhouses is not a great job. And I suppose I should also say chicken farming and pig farming is also not a great job. So cattle ranchers they're still ranching in the way that they have always ranched. There are still, despite consolidation, quite a few small dairies that are raising dairy cows in a way, not radically.
And the cow-calf operations are super decentralized and.
Yep. Yeah, but pork and chicken have pretty thoroughly integrated. So, and that is because of agricultural consolidation. So, one of the things that we are looking at, and that others who are focused on plant-based meat and cultivated meat are looking at, is what does the transformation of the farm economy look like? And there are really interesting opportunities for people to convert, especially chicken and pig farms, into fermentation for, it's not plant-based, it's whole biomass fermentation, but alternatives that can be a part of replacing the products of industrial animal agriculture in new and exciting ways. And we would really like to see state and federal governments helping to make that transition, better for farmers and better for people who work in the farm economy.
Yeah, it's again, I'm not an expert on this landscape, but I spent a fair amount of time trying to understand it at the Fork, and I spent the better part of a year engaged with farmers all around the country on it. And the thing that struck me was, these are people who are actively dealing with the challenges of raising animals. And it's very interesting, and it's very interesting to be a critic of things that, when you look at them, look pretty awful. And animal welfare on animal farms it's easy to look pretty awful. But these folks care about these animals. They really, they don't like everything about what they're doing. So it doesn't surprise me to hear you getting a positive reception from people who feel like they've been squeezed out by the economies of scale, which have benefited consumers at the grocery store, but have really, I've always found this to be the most interesting thing about capitalism, right? Is the conversation sort of that was set in motion in a lot of ways by Marx was all about capital versus labor. So, okay, you hear farm consolidation, big companies consolidating into larger and larger farms, and that sounds like this capital versus labor. And what's not part of that conversation is the consumer. So the reason, probably the single biggest reason for that consolidation, right, is it's cheaper. So if you're a working class person that works in a minimum wage job, you want whatever is going to bring that meal to your plate and to your family's plate as cheap as possible. And on balance, that's probably a good thing. But the way that has actually happened has left a lot of kind of wreckage in its path. Like, let's focus on that a little bit. So you talk about, let's focus on the environmental impacts, because I think how do you lay out for people what the benefits are of this transformation, and so what are the problems that it's trying to solve or to destroy?
Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, number one is we're going to need to feed 9.7, 9.8 billion people by 2050. The inefficiency of growing massive amounts of crops and funneling them through animals so that we can eat animals drives up the price of those crops globally. So we were talking about biofuels a minute ago. There was a UK government report indicating that the diversion of crops, especially wheat and corn, into biofuels was driving up the price of wheat and corn by 30%. On the basis of FAO numbers that said that 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat were going into biofuels. That same FAO report said that 756 million metric tons of corn and wheat were being fed to chickens and pigs and other farm animals. And as we mentioned a minute ago, 85% of the global soy crop, more than 200 million metric tons of soy, are fed to farm animals. So you're literally talking about something that drives up the price of wheat and corn and soy and prices out the hundreds of millions of people who are living in nutritional deficit. So from a sort of feed the world standpoint, cycling crops through animals is pretty bad. Environmentally, it's pretty problematic. So climate change as just one from myriad examples. And this makes intuitive sense too. So go back to the 9 calories in to get 1 calorie out for chicken. That means 9 times as much land, 9 times as much water, 9 times as many pesticides and herbicides. And now you're shipping that land to a feed, you're shipping those crops, 9 times as many crops, and you're shipping them to a feed mill. That's a gas guzzling, pollution spewing vehicle. You're operating the feed mill, which is energy intensive and polluting. Then shipping the feed to the farm, operating the farm, shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, operating the slaughterhouse. Once you crunch the environmental numbers, the United Nations says every environmental issue, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global, these inefficiencies that I'm talking about are one of the top 3 causes. And on the issue of climate change, 40 times as much climate change per calorie of protein to get a calorie of protein from chicken, which is the least climate change inducing meat, 40 times as much climate change relative to legumes like peas and sorghum and chickpeas and lentils and so on. So the climate impact is pretty colossal. And for people who aren't that worried about climate impact, the amount of land that's required, the amount of water that's required, the destruction of the oceans from the commercial fishing industry, environmentally, it's a big problem. And then global health is the third one that we tend to focus on, and in particular, antibiotic use. So if listeners want to scare, Google the end of working antibiotics. The former president of the World Health Organization said the end of working antibiotics is the end of modern medicine. So penicillin doesn't work. And a big part of that is the fact that you need a course of antibiotics. It's going to be at most 10 days. Farm animals are on antibiotics for their entire lives. They're dosed prophylactically. And so 70% of antibiotics in the US, 70% of the antibiotics produced by pharmaceuticals, they're fed to farm animals, not to human beings. And that leads to antibiotic resistance. And the UK government, which believes in climate change and thinks it's a huge problem, they say antibiotic resistance is a bigger threat to the human race than climate change. So the way that we're producing meat now has a whole bunch of external costs. Those are just a few of them. And if we make meat from plants or we grow meat from cells, no need for antibiotics, fraction of the caloric requirements, fraction of the climate impact, and we can feed a lot more people because we're not wasting so much of the food that we're producing.
So I, one of the other things that is part of that environmental impact that I've seen these firsthand, and I've actually talked to farmers who, are worried about this, but it's difficult to deal with, which is the runoff from waste. And there's this dead zone forming in the Gulf that because the waste. So especially like a hog operation, they'll have these large lagoons of waste, and they inevitably, especially if there's any type of large rain, like substantial rain event, they can seep into groundwater, make their way into the rivers, and they produce. My understanding is, and please correct me if I'm misremembering this, but my understanding is the mechanism that causes this sort of devastating impact on the ocean is the waste produces algae growth that just sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and so you just end up with giant regions of the Gulf that everything in it dies because the algae.
Dead zones.
So and there's not, that's like a classic externality example. You've got a runoff that you don't have to pay for. You've got your waste, you're doing the best you can, you're meeting standards, but there's a heavy rain, off it goes into the drinking water, it goes into the rivers. There's no great way to capture it. To play a devil's advocate, one could say, okay, well, gasoline, fossil fuels are actually, at the pump, one of the most highly taxed products that you can buy. And we've got all these different layers of regulation and costs to try to capture the externalities of things like agriculture. And yet these products are still cheaper. So you're telling me an efficiency story, which is, oh, you're using all this land to produce all these row crops, all these monoculture share crop, like row crops into feed. And yet the Impossible Burger is still more expensive than a comparable meat patty. What's driving that delta? Because I mean, the engine of one of the circulatory system of markets is the pricing system, and it kind of tells us supply and demand and how efficient the thing is. So the fact that these products are still more expensive, why is that?
Well, I mean, I think there are two reasons, and I'll go kind of in I think probably reverse order of importance, but just to because you just said supply and demand. I mean, fundamentally, it's supply and demand. They cannot yet keep up with demand. I mean, from when the Impossible Burger launched in 2016 up until, gosh, probably a year ago, maybe less than a year ago, restaurants were having trouble getting it. I would go around to university campuses to give talks, and the Yale dining services director came to my talk just to ask me if I could intercede with Impossible so that he could get the Impossible Burger. And some restaurants were launching it and they'd have it on the menu, but then they'd run out. I was in Canada soon after A&W did their national Canadian launch of the Beyond Burger. And it was hilarious. They had the Beyond hats, they had the Beyond aprons, but there were no Beyond Burgers to be had at any A&W in Canada. So, supply and demand, they could probably charge more than they are
Right.
and still not be able to keep up with demand. So that's sort of part of it. The other part of it is just economies of scale. Impossible and Beyond are still a tiny fraction of 1% of the global beef market, even they're a fraction of 1% of the US beef market. So they have not, economies of scale have not kicked in. There are not lots and lots of factories. Their soy demand in the case of Impossible, their pea demand in the case of Beyond. The planting of peas has not caught up to Beyond's demand. Impossible did switch from oat protein to soy protein precisely because there wasn't enough oat protein to supply the demand that they had for the Impossible Burger. But we're still very early days. But yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic that as they scale up from being, 1/10 of 1% of the beef market to 1%, then 5%, then 10%, the prices will come down. And because the production process is so much more efficient, they will outcompete on price. But it's gonna require a little bit of time for the supply of the raw ingredients as well as the manufacturing to catch up.
Yeah, there's one of the things I think is not generally thought about in this equation is like, you can, when you're trying to build anything, right? I like to build stuff. The way you get better at building is having tools, right? So it's way easier to dig a ditch with a shovel than with your hands. And so the question then becomes, I think this is one of the most important elements of economies of scale, because I think economies of scale for people who don't most of the time you hear this term, you think, oh, if you make more of it, it gets cheaper. But then if you scratch the surface of it, you start to ask, well, why would it get cheaper when you make more? And I think one of the big mechanisms is, what Adam Smith said, it's the extent of the market. The specialization is sort of determined by the extent of the market. So when you're just a tiny market making these products, there's a whole bunch of opportunities to build custom tools that could make your process faster, better, cheaper. But who's going to make those tools if they can only sell it to one company in a small quantity? And so you have to, that the economies of scale means not just that they're going to make more, but they're going to make more, and whole industries are going to build around the making of more. Just the way this sort of the auto supply parts industry is built around Detroit to supply all the specialized equipment, and we can extract pea proteins. When we do it at this volume, we can use this other process that needs these big special vats or whatever. And if you have to build all that stuff bespoke, how do you do it? I think that's one of the big reasons. That's at least my understanding of one of the things that gets unlocked by economies of scale. I like to keep my monologue going for a little bit. Eggs is such an interesting product from a history perspective for me, because it's simple. Chicken eats food, lays an egg. So the basic manufacturing of it's in the chicken. So the question then is, well, how is it that eggs got so much cheaper? And it's that consolidation you were talking about. Well, walking around picking the eggs up by hand is really slow and expensive. Having them all be in cages that lay onto a conveyor belt is a heck of a lot cheaper. And I noticed the price of an egg from a small scale, like pasture raised operation that basically looks like a 1950s egg farm, or even if they're in the little rotating huts or whatever, if they're really just doing it by hand. The last time I looked at this, those kind of real small operations would sell for about $10 for a dozen of eggs. If you adjust for inflation, that's the price of a dozen eggs in 1950. So the entire reduction in the price of eggs, because you go to the gas station and you get a dozen eggs for $2. That whole reduction you can basically account for with the mechanization, the putting the chickens in these small cages, all in this massive row with these large conveyor belts, and then having robots that can just auto sort them. And the animal welfare results of that are hideous, because you're talking about these animals living their whole lives on a sheet of paper. But that's the kind of thing it sounds like you're talking about, right? We need kind of that revolution, but for these plant-based proteins.
Yeah, and that revolution is coming, and we need it for the plant-based and for the cultivated. But that is a really good explanation of what we are just starting to see on the cultivated meat side as well. As some of these companies are raising tens of millions of dollars, or in the case of Memphis Meats, hundreds of millions of dollars to grow meat from cells, you're seeing some of the therapeutics companies that have traditionally been supplying cell therapeutics for human medicine saying, oh, wait, there's an opportunity here for us to be a B2B supplier. If you are straight to consumer and you're doing the entire vertical and you have to figure everything out, that's going to be super expensive. But if you can have one company helping you with the cells, and another company helping you with the scaffolding, and another company helping you with the media, and there might be a whole bunch of companies helping with the various portions of media. There are companies producing the various elements of the media, companies putting the media together, and then bioreactor design, and then actually manufacturing the bioreactors, and there might be perfusion bioreactors, and then the later bioreactors. If you're one company and you have to do all of that, obviously that's going to be a radically different proposition. Take your Detroit and all of the companies that supply the car manufacturers.
Yeah, giant companies that just produce one type of screw.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the exact same thing is going to be true on both the plant-based side and the cultivated side. And we need different forms of manufacturing and all of the various inputs. And the industries don't exist yet and need to, if the goal is actually to replace industrial animal meat with meat biomimicked from plants and cultivated meat. And we're really just sort of getting going on that, which explains why it's a little pricier at the moment. But the fact that it's only a little pricier, despite how far away we are from anything like competing economies of scale, I think does point to the promise of what scale up can do, and what having an adequate supply of the protein inputs, as just one example, new and better manufacturing processes, as another example, can really do for the price side of this price and taste equation.
So, and I think I imagine there's multiple answers here, but where do you see some of the biggest current pain points or opportunities for leverage? Like where, and it might be at the product by product level, but what is like the most vexing problem for unlocking big productivity gains on I mean, how should I even think about that? Because I know like the Impossible is made in a different way than the Beyond, but are there some key points like across the spectrum of these products that breakthrough is, you can kind of see that there's that breakthrough would be like a kind of step function improvement? Where are those?
Well, there are a bunch of them on the plant-based side and on the cultivated side. My hunch is that manufacturing is going to be the biggest on the plant-based side. And one thing that is just sort of an interesting observation. So Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods jointly won the Champions of the Earth Award from the UN Environment Program, because even at the tiny economies of scale that they're at right now, the life cycle analyses indicate that they use a fraction of the land, a fraction of the water, produce a fraction of the climate impact to produce a product that is a replacement for a product that has, across those various factors, significantly greater adverse impact. And then Impossible Foods at the Consumer Electronics Show last year won the award for like best product at the Consumer Electric Show, and it's a plant-based burger, which is pretty fascinating and kind of exciting, and underlines the degree to which this is food technology. Nevertheless, the way that the products are being put together is not nearly as efficient as it could be. So one of the things to note across plant-based and cultivated is that even now at the tiny scale that they are, they just have overwhelming opportunity for improvement. They have, in particular, overwhelming opportunity for efficiency improvement. And for people who care about sustainability, that means, colossal sustainability gains. When you're working within the confines of animal physiology, you're not going to get too much better than 9 calories in to 1 calorie out for a chicken. The chicken is, it's an animal, and it's not going to, no matter how little it moves, it's still going to be, breathing, and its heart is going to be beating, and they're going to have to live for, 7 weeks to 6-7 weeks to get to slaughter. Whereas with cultivated, with plant-based meat, it's just boom, turn it into meat. Just ship it to the manufacturing plant and it becomes meat. With cultivated meat, 6 days to get the chicken meat weight from a chicken. So 6-7 weeks to raise live chicken, 6 days with cultivation, an hour with plant-based. And so the efficiency gains are just going to come and come and come on the plant-based and the cultivated side, whereas the efficiency gains on the conventional animal meat side are going to be like super incremental and small from this point out.
So we eat a lot of these products. The Beyond Meat sausage is maybe, in my personal opinion, one of the most impressive of them.
It's pretty great
from a flavor perspective. I mean, I guess it was over Christmas, perhaps, because it's been tragically long since I've been with my parents in person because of COVID, and they're in Jersey and I'm in Texas. Like one of the last nights we were there for Christmas, so I'm going to make you the vegan Italian meal, and heated up some water, cooked some pasta, fried some hot Italian sausage from Beyond, and then the Kite Hill ricotta, which is also a fantastic product. I think it's made with almonds. And I was expecting my parents to do something like little weird, like, and they really liked it. They were like, this is actually really pretty close. It's pretty good. Like the mouthfeel, the flavor, even like there isn't weird aftertastes. So I think in some ways for me at least, I think the Impossible Burger actually from Burger King, as however they're preparing it, and the Beyond Italian sausage, and then I would put Just Eggs up there because the way those cook and work in a scramble is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Are like, they have crossed the threshold as a product where it's like, oh, this makes it super easy as someone that likes animal product foods to not eat them, because I can make a scrambled eggs with, Vita Life or Kite Hill, fake cheese. And it's great. The sausage is great. The burger products are great. Chicken has been a weak spot for the plant-based products, it seems like.
Which is, that's kind of funny because it was the Beyond Meat chicken that catapulted Beyond Meat into the, sort of global consciousness among people who are following food innovation. It's what prompted Bill Gates. Bill Gates tried the Beyond Meat chicken and wrote a blog called The Future of Food. And his quote was, "What I just ate was not just a clever meat substitute. What I just ate is the future of food." It was also the Beyond Meat chicken that got Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. He spoke at the Milken Global Summit, I think in 2016 now. And he was asked to talk about technological innovations that he thinks will improve life for humanity by a factor of at least tenfold in the fairly near future. And he mostly talked about stuff you'd expect Eric Schmidt to talk about: 3D printers for infrastructure and watches that know you're sick before you know you're sick, and self-driving cars. But the first thing he talked about was plant-based meat. And he talked about it, not because you and I want a tastier veggie burger. He talked about it for its capacity to solve those, how do we feed 9.7 billion people by 2050, and what do we do about climate change? And he saw plant-based meat as a solution to that. And it was Beyond Meat's chicken that did it there. It was Beyond Meat's chicken that got Mark Bittman from the New York Times, who has written actual cookbooks about cooking animal-based chicken.
Yeah.
And
Mark Bittman's got a real bone to pick with Lucky Charms. Let me tell you, when I interviewed Mark, he beat up on Lucky Charms like 4 or 5 times in the conversation. It was like, I get it, they're kind of fake, but you're killing my childhood, Mark.
That's really funny. But I mean, to your point though, Beyond Meat pulled the Beyond Meat chicken probably a year and a half ago and said it's not good enough. It no longer meets our standards. So they were selling quite a lot of it. So it was an interesting decision. But they're coming out with a new one. I think you're going to see some excellent chicken products. The Gardein chicken is actually very good. But I think you're going to see chicken products from Beyond probably fairly soon, and hopefully from Impossible in the next year or 18 months. And I suspect that that we're all gonna like them as much as we like their sausage products. The Beyond sausage, I agree with you, is pretty fantastic. The Impossible sausage is also pretty fantastic.
Oh, so I guess I've had the Impossible sausage at maybe it's Starbucks. That's been the thing that's one of the most exciting things to come full circle from the beginning of our conversation and Lisa's Veggie Burger is the adoption of these products at fast food is pretty transformative. It feels like the fact that you can get a Impossible Whopper. Like, I was pretty shocked to see. I didn't think they had the productive capacity to supply the Impossible Whopper. And my father-in-law, who's the Burger King franchisee, he has said that Impossible Whopper has caused double-digit growth for Burger King. I mean, it is a absolute slam dunk, massive business success as a product.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I don't know for sure how the sausage at Starbucks is going, but I ask each time I'm in a Starbucks, which now with COVID-19 is a lot less than it used to be. And each time I go into a Starbucks and ask how it's selling, they say it's selling extraordinarily well. And an interesting thing to underline about that is that it comes with cheese and egg. So it's non-vegans who are eating the Impossible sausage, and the default for the Whopper is not vegan. The default for the Carl's Jr. Beyond Burger is not vegan. So, I mean, these are products that are appealing to meat eaters, which is what they're designed to do.
So, you mentioned one of the things that you're trying to accomplish is to encourage open source research and intellectual property. And at a philosophical level, I'm actually, even though I'm in the creative business, I actually think intellectual property is not super legitimate. I got into an argument with a sort of nationalistic conservative who was all complained about China, and he said, well, and he thought he was going to get me on this. He said, well, what about intellectual property? You know, they're stealing our intellectual property. My response is like, I don't think that's a thing, stealing intellectual property. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, okay, well, we were having dinner, and I said, well, if I take your glass against your will, I've stolen your glass, but I can't, you no longer have it. I have your glass now, and you don't have your glass. But if I copy the concept of a glass and make my own, you still have your glass. I've not stolen anything. Like intellectual property, like property at some level requires scarcity. You can't steal things without taking them away from someone else. But I do understand the argument that if you're Beyond Meat or you're Impossible Foods and you have brought investors on to underwrite a research process, during which time you're making no revenue, and you need to recoup that R&D with the sale of the product. How does that work? How do you, as you know, what's the sort of big picture economics of democratizing the intellectual property here? Is it just that the innovation and the sort of the competition and differentiation moves to other dimensions besides those fundamental technologies that these companies have developed? Do the companies that have inspired you to start GFI, do they like this idea of you creating an open source bank of IP to make these products? What's the dynamics there?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably Impossible and Beyond both feel like they have enough of a. I mean, it's helpful that people like Pat and Ethan and Josh Tedrick, for that matter, and Uma and Lou at Memphis and Blue Nalu and Mike Sully. Anyway, I could keep naming people, but they're so far it's mission aligned people, and then there's also just a strong degree to which anything that gets open sourced they can use too.
Right.
So I don't think there's a tremendous fear that suddenly all of their secrets are going to be open sourced. I think it's, there'll be a lot more open source science, and it won't help them more than anybody else, but it will help them. And it's not going to, it's not going to hinder them. They're not going to lose out at all. And what we've seen is, GFI does sign-on letters. So part of our lobby work, it's not just, it's a lot more powerful to go to members of Congress and say, we have Unilever and we have the Mushroom Institute and we have, Merck, KGaA, and we have, a company called Greenleaf, which is owned by the biggest meat producer in Canada. And these folks are saying, you will help our businesses by funding this open access research. So I think we had about 35 different, mostly companies, a couple of trade groups, I think only 2 other NGOs, the Consumer Federation of America and the Center for Biological Diversity, who signed on to the letter. But it was mostly companies saying, this will be good for our company. if you fund this open access science. And so, Unilever and all of these other companies, they see this as work that will also help them with what they're trying to accomplish.
Has there been, along similar lines, the start of the computer revolution in like our modern time, you can sort of trace back to the Homebrew Computer Club and this bunch of punks in garages trading code, copying each other, and that, Bill Gates himself had said at one point that if copyright had applied to software code in the 1970s, we wouldn't have a computer industry. So there's obviously like these huge sort of systemic network benefits of open access to underlying technologies and languages and processes. And are you seeing private funding of open source technologies on this front? Because it's certainly possible. I mean, it's happened in the technology industry, and I mean, obviously, open source conceptually in a lot of ways originates in software.
Yeah, so GFI started a program to do precisely that. We've had two. It's called our competitive grants program. So we went to 1R universities all over the world and basically advertised, hey, we have this pool in the first year of a little over $1 million for cultivated meat research, $2 million for plant-based meat research. We got proposals from all over the world. We funded 14 of them, I think in 7 different countries. And Nature magazine wrote about this program. And on the cultivated meat side, they said the $1.15 million that we gave away was more open access research than had been funded across all sources over the previous 20 years. So $1.15 million was more than had been funded in the previous 20 years. So we just we awarded another, I guess, about $3 million in grants for cultivated. So doubling again the amount of open access science into that. And then on the plant-based side, the $2 million that we gave was probably 10 times what had gone into plant-based meat research and like all of time before that from an open access vantage. But I will say we've been very pleasantly surprised by our appeals to governments. And again, it's not asking governments to put more money than they were already putting into R&D. It's just take some of your current R&D budget and put it into this. And we've met with success in the US, in Europe, in Israel, in India so far. And we're optimistic about making that happen in other countries as well. So I really do think it's just nobody had sort of gone to governments and said, hey, this is a solution to some problems where you're putting R&D money into now. What about putting some R&D money into this? So I think we're going to see a lot more open access research, sort of year on year for a while. And our big goal is to basically create an arms race, but focused on food technology, focused on making meat from plants or growing meat directly from cells. And the government or governments that, for once and for all, divorces meat from the external costs of industrial animal agriculture, divorces meat from the need for live animals, they'll have bragging rights for the end of time.
It is interesting, and I'm obviously, as a classical liberal, I'm always skeptical of everything government does, but you can't. It is a matter of fact that military research has been. Maybe it's been wasteful. Maybe they've spent 10 times what they needed to spend to get the positive benefits, whether it's Velcro or GPS or whatever. But it has worked. Like military research programs, DARPA, just weapons systems, all the rest, NASA, they're all that's all military at the end of the day, has actually been a source of innovation for the US. It does seem like there's something to the sort of international arms race aspect of getting government research funds to not just be sort of weird boondoggles. Like you need like the global marketplace of governments as competitive entities. It seems like. So I think
Yeah,
that's
no,
a
I
really
think that's right. And I mean, we look at something like, China spends more money on ag research than the United States, and they have an awful lot of issues with food safety and food security.
yeah.
And they want to be the global leader on the Paris Climate Agreement. So this would be a way for them to sort of show that and take that leadership, focusing on removing animals from the equation of meat production. And you've got governments like, the United States and Sonny Perdue, the Secretary of Agriculture, and Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, got together and said, we want to be the global leader. And they were talking about regulatory, but you can imagine them also like looking at China. If China decided to put hundreds of millions of dollars into this and saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't want China to be the leader on this. And then you've got Israel, which is a small country that wants to be food secure. They'd like to produce as much of their food locally as possible. And they've got world-class tissue engineering and plant biology universities. So it makes a lot of sense to have an awful lot of innovation there. Singapore, basically Israel, but even smaller.
Right.
Fantastic innovation and a great desire to be food secure. So there are, the European Union takes issues like antibiotic resistance and other sort of let's do food innovation in a way to solve problems, and they take that stuff seriously. So you can see how a global arms race, sort of space race, arms race, whatever, but focused on let's divorce meat from the need for live animals and all of the external costs that come with that. You can imagine what that would look like. And if we're able to spur that on and make that happen, I think we could see progress in this area happen a heck of a lot more quickly than obviously, relying on a couple of Silicon Valley startups for the most part.
So I put a note to myself with 3 letters that I wanted to ask you about. They're the 3 uncomfortable letters in food innovation, especially if you're sort of adjacent.
I have no idea what you're going to say.
So I'll set the table. I'll build the dramatic tension. So the constellation of concerns that you're addressing, I think, are universal, but they certainly fall on progressive ears very strongly. Climate change, sustainability, environmental impacts, animal welfare. I'm not saying that people right of center, or I hate the left-right thing, and I think it's also cracking up as we speak. But in general, I think this constellation of issues is especially appealing to sort of urbanites and left of center folks. And yet, and maybe it hasn't been as vocal in recent times, but then again, everything's been drowned out by COVID. You have this anti-genetically modified organism movement. And I know maybe none of the products you're describing are technically genetically modified in some sense, but
Impossible uses GMO soy.
Right. So, but they fall into this category of they're not natural, whatever that's supposed to mean. You don't, meat doesn't grow on trees. So
it grows in intensive factory farms.
So, how have you dealt with this? Because it's something that, I happen to think genetically, I think the whole GMO issue is sort of a weird red herring and shrouded in misinformation, but that's me. People are passionate about it. How do you deal with the GMO ruckus, loudness in the spaces you're in?
I will say that the issue that comes up significantly more regularly is the idea of is this a processed food? And people have heard processed food, and they have sort of a visceral negative reaction. But it's pretty easy to have conversations with people about what it means that something is a processed food. Generally, it means it has added sugar, it has added salt, it has fiber removed, it has complex carbohydrates removed, it's high in saturated fat. It's sort of this thing that tends to characterize these ultra-processed foods. And you look at even the peer review articles about processed foods, and they're talking about things that are calorie dense and nutrient poor. Like that's
Right.
what characterizes processed foods. And the most recent article on this, and sort of the best of the peer-reviewed articles, points out that the processed foods have like massive amounts of added sugars in the processed foods that they were testing. So then you point out that the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Burger, the plant-based meats, they have lower saturated fat than what they're compared to, animal-based meat. They have no cholesterol at all. They have complex carbohydrates where meat has none. They have fiber where meat has none. They have no added sugars whatsoever. They have no trans fats, which FDA says the amount of trans fat you're supposed to be, the ideal trans fat for the human body is 0. And they have no trans fats, but animal products inherently have trans fats. So across the macronutrients, the plant-based products do significantly better than animal-based products across the metrics that matter when people are talking about processed foods. And there haven't been, that I'm aware of, randomized controlled trials comparing plant-based meat to animal-based meat, but there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence. I mean, my favorite one is the former president of the American College of Cardiology, a guy named Kim Williams, and he talked about the only difference he made in his diet was going from animal meat to plant-based meat, and his cholesterol level dropped, and he lost weight, and he had more energy, and he started, writing about the value of plant-based meat over animal-based meat. There are still some people who have sort of a visceral negative reaction to plant-based meat as a processed food, but most of those people are not eating a lot of or any industrial animal meat. They're generally eating, beans and rice. A lot of them are actually vegetarians, and quite honestly, we don't care what vegetarians are eating. So this is for people who are eating industrial animal meat, and it's an alternative for them, quite honestly. And then the last thing to say is cultivated meat is a more pure, more natural product. It's just growing cells in a different way. But because you're not using live animals, there's not going to be, in the case of fish, any dioxin or heavy metal contamination. In the case of other animals, there's not going to be any of the antibiotics or other drugs that can pollute normal industrial animal meat. There's going to be a fraction of the likelihood of E. coli or salmonella or whatever. It's just a safer, purer way to create meat.
And to come back to the genetic modification part, what are your thoughts about that? Because it is as you switch to a focus on plants, I think in a lot of ways success might get more concern and more impact for people who are worried about GMO crops. Have you thought much about, I'm sure you've thought about GMO crops, but I mean, have you thought much about the intersection of the concern about GMO crops with the future of, plant-based meat alternatives?
I mean, we believe that companies should produce products that consumers will want to eat as replacements for the products of industrial animal production. And it's been fascinating to see Impossible Foods is just like unapologetically, we are using GMO soy from the American Midwest, and here's why. And then Beyond Meat is like, we don't think our customers want us to use GMO, so we're not. Both of those companies are doing extraordinarily well. So it's, it's sort of a capitalist system that has room for both, it seems. And we think that's probably a good thing. In areas that don't want GMO soy, I imagine Impossible will go and they'll source non-GMO soy, or previously they were using potato protein. I imagine that they can come up with other proteins to use as the ingredients in their products.
One of the things that's interesting about the GMO question is, in a world where these products truly reach a tipping point and start to just dominate, a world where we start to see a decline in the amount of land used for animal feed, I would actually think that the need for GMO crops might decline, because I think my understanding is one of the principal benefits of GMO seeds is, productivity per acre.
I mean, yes, that's true. Capitalism being what it is, I'm not sure that it will actually. I mean, the amount of GMO crops will absolutely decline, because you don't have the inefficiency of growing massive amounts of GMO crops to feed them to farm animals. So, the chickens in the United States, and pigs in the United States, and cattle and farm fish in the United States, they are eating massive amounts of GMO crops. So if your concern is GMO as in a technology that you think is harmful to the environment, or has other ill effects beyond your personal consumption, you're going to have a fraction of the GMO crops from eating an Impossible Burger, which is produced with GMO soy, than from eating a chicken or a pig or a farm animal that has been produced, that has consumed far more GMO crops than the GMO in that Impossible Burger. So that is, I suppose, one thing just to point out. And then I think you're also right. If we move toward, I mean, again, consumers will dictate, but as we move from growing massive amounts of feed crops to growing crops that people are eating directly, that will allow for a wider diversity of crops, and that will also allow for consumers who would like their plant-based proteins to be produced without GMO to be able to ensure that that happens for sure.
Now, I imagine you don't want to pick favorites, but theoretically it feels like large-scale cultivated meat, sort of flesh in a tube, as upsetting as that sounds when you
it's
say
not
it.
In a tube. I mean, like
in a vat, flesh grown in a vat, in a chemical
brewery.
vat.
No, it looks like a brewery. You drink beer out of.
It's brewed meat, brewed flesh,
cultivated.
Cultivated flesh. I'm saying flesh to be provocative, but it's also true. I would think that's got to be the surefire winner if it can get to scale. I mean, because it's sort of the quote unquote real thing. Like you can get a real steak that is a steak. It's not a 3D printed pea protein thing that's pretty close but not quite there, and mouth feels close but not quite there, and it doesn't soak up the A1 sauce quite the way I like. I mean, you could actually get a steak.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that, so I tend to agree with you on everything that you just said, but I will just be the voice of Pat Brown for a second, the founder of Impossible Foods, who will say that he doesn't grant your premise, because you can get the steak that is quite there. We can do with plants exactly what we can do with animals, but more efficiently. So if you say not quite there, then sure. But he believes, and I believe too, and GFI believes, that we can biomimic meat with plants. We can give people everything that they want, and we can actually do a little bit better. The reason I agree with you, though, is I do think that there is a significant subset of the population that just wants to eat animal meat. So even if you give them something that is indistinguishable, and I think we can get to indistinguishable even on steak, although that's going to take a lot longer than burgers and nuggets and fish sticks.
Yeah.
But even if you give them something that's indistinguishable, there is just something visceral in some people. They want to eat animal meat. And then the question is, like, how many people is that? Is it more than plant-based meat? Is it fewer than plant-based meat? Once you take out the external costs, my guess is it's going to be pretty significant. And I would guess it's probably even a little bit more. But you're right. I mean, GFI is agnostic on this. So you would probably get a very different answer from, you would be likely to get a very different answer from, like, if you had somebody different from GFI on. So we don't have a GFI position on this, other than to say we do think there will be room for both plant-based and cultivated, and what the percentages are, is really anybody's guess at this point.
We haven't talked much about fish. So where do you see, where are things headed with fish substitutes? Because I also haven't seen, I think I may have seen a salmon product, but it seems to have been a lower priority than chicken and beef, or hamburger. What's the state of the art on fish substitutes?
Yeah, it might be slightly earlier days on the seafood and other fish, or fish and other seafood side of things. But there are some interesting companies, some interesting startups. There's one that GFI had a hand in starting called Good Catch, that we are very excited about. There are a lot of cultivated seafood companies. So one called Finless Foods, another called Wild Type, another one called Blue Nalu, Shook Meats. So a lot of folks looking at the seafood side of things, doing it in cultivators, so actual fish flesh. Slightly fewer, oddly enough, on the plant-based side, but New Wave Foods, I think, has gone back to plant-based, but they might be cultivated fish. There's a company that has moved to Singapore called Sophie's Kitchen, which is doing plant-based fish. Gardein has a plant-based fish fillet that you can get at Veggie Grill, that is pretty good. So there are a small number of them, but they don't yet have sort of their Beyond Meat or their Impossible Foods. Although Good Catch definitely has designs on that.
Is there, so I saw, I think, is it Nestle that purchased what's the name of the company? They have a brand which I think was an acquisition.
Nestle purchased Sweet Earth.
Sweet Earth, that's what it is. Do you imagine that that's going to be a part of the next wave, which is these, the Cargills, the Tysons, the Nestles of the world, buying and scaling these startups? Is that part of the sort of the structure of the hope of this?
That is absolutely the structure of the hope of this. And if you had told me 5 years ago, when GFI was still sort of a glimmer in my eye, and had I hadn't even fully made the decision 5 years ago right now, that Tyson Foods and Cargill and JBS and Smithfield would all have plant-based meat lines, I would have thought you were crazy. But here we are. The 4 biggest meat companies in the world are all in on plant-based meat, which is pretty fascinating. And then Tyson and Cargill, which are the 2 largest US-based meat companies, and 2 of the 3 largest meat companies in the world, with JBS from Brazil being a little bit bigger, they have each invested in 2 cultivated meat companies. So both Tyson and Cargill have invested in Memphis Meats, and then Tyson has also invested in an Israeli cultivated meat company called Future Meat Technologies, and Cargill has invested in an Israeli cultivated meat company called Aleph Farms. And the conventional meat industry going all in on alternative proteins is pretty exciting and spectacular. And then, I think probably most of the plant-based and cultivated meat companies, they're either looking at IPO or they're looking at acquisition. And I think Sweet Earth being purchased by Nestle is a very good sign. And I could imagine and would be excited to see Tyson and Cargill and JBS purchase some of these plant-based and cultivated meat companies. And for people who don't follow venture capital, generally, you invest in a company, and then if you follow it, and if you like what's happening with it, you might make an offer to actually acquire that company. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if one of the cultivated meat companies that I just mentioned, or lots of the cultivated meat companies now have strategic big food investors. And that is those big food companies looking at the possibility of acquisition. So we're super bullish on that as a future.
One of the things that in this era of unrest and desire for change across a lot of dimensions. I think that's one of the things about markets that is probably least appreciated is how disruptive they are. I mean, I think at one level people hear this notion of disruption because of Silicon Valley and disruptors, and they think it's cool, even if Silicon Valley has gotten a little tarnished in recent years. But I think what's less appreciated is just how baked into the cake of the market process this creative destruction is. You've got, I mean, as you just said, you've got Cargill buying into a future that if you talk to an activist in 1970, they would say, well, that's just Satan. There's
if you talk to an activist in 2010, they'd say that's just Satan.
Right. You're talking about Satan. I don't want to hear it. They are bought into this evil system. It serves their whatever, and it's not. And so I think, I think this is one of the things that makes me love capitalism, is because in pursuit of giving people what they want, I think a competitive market will destroy itself to be reborn out of the ashes, something new and better. At the same time, and as we kind of wrap up our conversation, I want to give some credit to your former life and your colleagues at PETA. And that is, there's a supply side and there's demand, right? And consumer demand fundamentally as an individual is about your preferences. And so how do your preferences change? And one of the ways your preferences change is by being, having your mind changed, as you did. You read a book and you got engaged in a subject, and it changed the way you thought about things. And so I think there's such an important role to play for all the different aspects of people engaged around the transformation of food and innovation and ethics in food. And that's something that for me personally, I've come to feel that as a real ethic, thanks to Lisa and thanks to our film and thanks to meeting you, Bruce, and Mackie and the people who are really making a difference in this space. And it's been an eye-opening thing for me, because I think, rabble rousers can be a real pain in the neck. And a lot of times half the things they're saying are crazy, or they're demonizing people. And at the same time, I think you need all of these things. You need activism, you need innovation, you need, you need good public policy that isn't actually promoting bad things like, biofuels, and instead trying to encourage things that are actually good, or at least be neutral on the matter. And so, it's exciting to just see what you've been able to accomplish. And I think you're coming from the perfect place to be playing this leadership role that I think you are, because you've been through all these different parts of the process. Do you have anything in terms of, what
I did just want to build on what you just said. Another, that was all, I think, really true. I think you mentioned John Mackey again in there, and I just want to say, from the plant-based product side, there's literally no individual who has been more influential than John Mackey. Beyond Meat, I think, maybe it would exist without John, but it was John that opened up Whole Foods regionally and then nationally. John was responsible for the success. I mean, Whole Foods was responsible, but it was literally John at Whole Foods who was like, yes, I'm excited about this. Diet cheese, I think maybe Kite Hill cheese, but a whole bunch of these plant-based alternatives. I think, fascinating, because John himself is not actually that keen on processed foods, but he was super bullish on the idea of replacing industrial animal meat with these alternatives. And he personally got behind them, which meant Whole Foods got behind them. And nobody has been more responsible for more companies getting sort of their entree into the customers who you were just flagging. So you need the customers, but you also need the outlets that get the products to the customers. And for a long, long time, that was Whole Foods all by itself. So
Oh yeah.
Whole Foods was the absolute trendsetter on animal welfare issues. It was the only grocery chain taking those things seriously. And it was also the trendsetter on the plant-based alternatives to industrial animal meat. And now all of the grocery stores are on board, but it was Whole Foods all by itself for a pretty long time.
I know it is a testament to what one person can do. You said that about Lisa with the burger at Burger King, but what John Mackey has done for vegetarians, for animal welfare, and for the future of food, it just there is no way to overstate the impact that he himself as an individual has had. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, I mean, there's literally nobody who has had a more positive impact on animal welfare, and nobody who has had a more positive impact on removing animals from agriculture altogether by making it easier for people to eat alternatives.
And I think you and I can both say there's probably nobody that you or I know that is a bigger hardcore believer in the power of capitalism to do good in the world than John as well. So it's like it's all very well aligned.
Or significantly more competitive at whatever sport you want to take him on in.
That is the truth. That is the truth.
He plays a mean frisbee golf.
So wrap us out with, what would be closing thoughts that you would want to make sure everyone takes away from our conversation as far as where they can learn more about GFI and what's on the horizon for the Good Food Institute and Bruce Friedrich.
Thanks, John. So GFI is at gfi.org, for a sort of crash course in sort of essential materials, gfi.org/essentials. And we have a couple of positions open at the moment. We have an associate director for legislative affairs. We're hiring a senior policy specialist, and we're about to open half a dozen more positions. So if people are interested in dedicating themselves to this vocationally, check out gfi.org/jobs. We're pretty constantly hiring, especially scientists, but we usually have a couple of other jobs open on the corporate engagement side, the policy side, and kind of always the science side. So would love to have people check us out and think about joining us vocationally.
Well, Bruce, I appreciate you taking all the time, and I want to encourage everybody to check out the companies that Bruce has talked about and the work that GFI is doing. I mean, this is transformative stuff, and it couldn't be more important. It's, transforming one of the essential inputs of life.
Thank you very much, John. And I guess I will take the opportunity to say we're also a nonprofit organization powered by philanthropy. So no government money, no corporate money. If people want to add us to your philanthropic portfolio, we would be very honored.
You couldn't put the money in a better place. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.